Now, back live with Chris Kenny.
Don't forget, I've got a cracking panel coming up. Miranda Devine, Jane Marwick, Tanvir Ahmed and Simon Bruni will be joining me for the last hour, and we'll go the full circle on all these issues, white flight, Donald Trump and some media malarkey as well. But many of you would have caught up with the story that's been unfolding in recent weeks about Professor Peter Kidd, who's a scientist with the James Cook University up there in Queensland, who's taken a counter view to many of his colleagues when it comes to the climate change and the impact on the Great Barrier Reef. For his trouble, he's been kicked out of his job. He's been dismissed from the university, and there is a battle royal about to occur in the courts as a result of all that. He joins me via Skype from Townsville now. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Afternoon.
Look, I want to ask you first up, you say that you're a lefty. You tend to be a bit of a lefty you actually, though, have a different view to a lot of your colleagues when it comes to the status of the Great Barrier Reef. Can you explain that to us?
Well, I think it's nowhere near as badly damaged as a lot of my colleagues would suggest. I think a lot of the claims have been quite exaggerated. For example, the effect of warming, whether it's natural or otherwise, is fairly minimal on the reef, because a half a degree increase, which we've had maybe over the last 100 years, would have minimal effect. And in fact, all the corals on the Great Barrier Reef live further north in Papua New Guinea and Thailand, where the water is 1 or 2 degrees hotter, and they actually grow faster there. And that's just one of many examples of some of these threats to the reef, which don't seem to be anywhere near as bad as first claimed.
Certainly since I was a kid, I've heard about the demise of the reef. It's always under threat, whether it's the crown of thorns or cyclone damage or bleaching. These threats must exist, though, to some degree. How would you characterise how the reef has been handling these various issues, these various impacts, and what its outlook is?
Well, look, there's no doubt that periodically huge amounts of the reef just die from crown of thorns starfish outbreaks, which in my view are almost certainly entirely natural. Crown of thorns starfish are not a feral animal, they're a native species. Cyclones are probably the biggest thing. So in 2011, we lost almost all the coral in the southern part of the Great Barrier Reef. By 2016, there was 3.5 times more coral in the southern region of the Great Barrier Reef because of the recovery. So, like bushfires in the Australian forests, the reefs are actually quite capable of recovering for these genuinely natural phenomena.
But many of your colleagues, other scientists, of course, know about this. They know about the damage and they know about the recovery. How come we seldom hear about the recovery?
Well, to some extent, that may be the fault of the media. But
Absolutely.
I also agree that the scientists are very quick on occasions to use the graphic images of dead reef, acres, thousands of square kilometres of dead reef, to demonstrate a point.
How damaging can this be to people who rely on the reef for an income, in particularly when it comes to tourism, I suppose? I remember, of course, when Barack Obama was in Brisbane only a few years ago, he was basically warning people should tick it off their bucket list pretty soon because it won't be there much longer. It must be incredibly damaging if you're running some sort of a tourism business.
Yes, I just got an email just yesterday from a tourist operator saying exactly that. But it's not just that. You see, all this science which is claiming damage to the reef and the government legislation which is coming in is affecting the cane industry, it's affecting the cattle industry, the mining industry, partly through the effect on dredging, so dredging is much more tricky. And, of course, we have scientists wanting to close down the coal industry, and then the terrible publicity right around the world, don't bother going to see the reef because it's dead. Now, if you take away all those industries, we actually don't have much left in North Queensland. So this is actually a really important issue. And if this science is wrong, if we're doing all these things and we got it wrong, and I'm virtually certain that is the case because none of it's properly checked, it's really a bad thing for the North Queensland.
Yeah, now obviously you're speaking as a man who's lived all his life in this area. You're a qualified scientist. You've studied these issues in relation to the reef, and you love the reef. So how does it come to pass that by airing these views and the criticism, I suppose, of some of the checks and balances on some of your fellow scientists, that the university ends up actually dismissing you?
Well, they say that I've been uncollegial. They're saying that when I'm just asking for proper checking, testing and replication, and that because that is not occurring properly in these scientific institutions, then somehow I'm being uncollegial. Now, this is not good enough, actually. What should happen, if I'm wrong and there is proper checking of this science, then in fact what we should do is those institutions should tell me why I'm wrong rather than complain about it and get fired as a consequence.
Yeah, Peter, your earbug is just on your shoulder there. If you want to reach out your right shoulder, you'll be able to slip it back in. You can still hear me there, it's fine. Look, just on that though, I mean, the whole point of universities is they're supposed to test ideas and the contest of ideas and to debate perspectives in science as well as all the other areas. I just can't see how a university could see it's worth dismissing you just for disagreeing with your colleagues on scientific grounds and on the way these issues are presented.
Well, JC would claim it's for other things. They're saying that I mean, you should really ask them. You should get them on. But
Sure.
They're saying that they're doing it because of the way I have done it and some of the follow-up stuff which has come since. But in the end, it all goes back to the words I said on an Alan Jones show, where I basically say that some of the work the work from these scientific institutions is unreliable. But yes, when there are any sort of threats like this, it puts a chilling effect on everybody else. So everybody else at JCU and most other universities, JCU is not necessarily the worst. They see what happened to me, and it's just not worth going too close to that cliff edge. So you're better off just saying nothing. This is the problem.
This, I think, is the big problem. I'm glad you raised that. The idea that other scientists, and I know there are many of them who are concerned about how a whole range of global warming issues are portrayed as if there's only one fixed view and one fixed trajectory. They're very loath to speak out on the one hand because they'll be condemned in the way that you have been, but also I suppose they're rewarded in terms of grants and funding if they push another perspective.
And it's the opposite as well. I mean, I probably 5 or 6 years ago put in an application to the Australian Research Council to do some checking, testing and replicating of some of this work, and you can imagine that went up like a lead balloon. In fact, I was told by one of the reviewers for that in fact it goes against Australian Research Council funding rules because checking something doesn't create new knowledge, so I was knocked out at the first base. In fact, one of the things which I want to see happen is this is not just climate change or Great Barrier Reef science. The problem is right across science. It's called the replication crisis, and it looks like about 50% of important recent scientific results are wrong. This is major studies across many, many fields keep on coming up with this horrifying statistic. And I would actually like to see the Australian Research Council put aside 5% of their budget just to check some stuff, because this is not just climate change or reef science. We have a problem right across the board. Yeah,
great point. Now, of course, you're taking the university to task in the courts over wrongful dismissal. You had a GoFundMe page to try and get the funding because this is an expensive exercise. You've got all the money you need now to take them on, but it's going to take months now to play out through the courts.
Oh, yes, maybe to the end of the year. Who knows?
All right, well, good luck with that, and we wish you all the best.
Thanks very much.
That's Professor Peter Kidd there, formerly of the James Cook University up there in Townsville, joining us via Skype from his house at Townsville. There you go. He spoke up. He's got a divergent point of view, a dissenting point of view, if you like, all science-based, all science-based. This is exactly what we want in our universities. This is what universities ought to be encouraging. They are not areas that are there to develop some sort of a consensus. You don't have a vote on scientific fact. You test theories, and you test them and you test them and you test them until you understand that issues are either fact or not. And Professor Peter Kidd has just contested the prevailing wisdom of his fellow scientists up there in James Cook University and elsewhere when it comes to climate change and its impact on the Great Barrier Reef. There couldn't be anything more important to that part of the world than testing these issues, debating them properly in a frank way. And who is better to equipped to do that than the actual scientists with the knowledge? Instead, they boot him out. We've got some big problems in this country. Back after this. Let's bring in the panel. Let's start in the West first and introduce Jane Marwick, broadcaster, Sky News commentator. Thanks for joining us again, Jane.
Thank you very much for having me, Chris.
Great to have you on board. And here in the studio with me, Simon Bruni from that think tank the lefties love to hate, the IPA, the Institute of Public Affairs. Miranda Devine from the Daily Telegraph and Miranda Devine Live, 4 o'clock. Monday, Tuesday and Wednesdays on the Daily Telegraph. And Dr Tanveer Ahmed, good to see you. Councillor?
No, no longer.
No longer a councillor, a former councillor. There's nothing so formal as a former politician, is there?
Yeah.
Right. Now, I wanted to talk about Peter Ridd first. We had a chat to him, obviously, from Townsville in the last break. Miranda, this is extraordinary to see a bloke booted out for contesting ideas in a university.
Well, I mean, it's terrifying, you know, at a university of all places, which is meant to be the place where you do contest ideas, to have someone sacked, shut down simply because what did he do wrong? I mean, he said that the climate alarmists were speaking with one voice and that there was something else you could talk about, that there were maybe other aspects of the science that
kind of demonstrable, isn't it? Well, demonstrably true, that is.
Yeah. So, I mean, a terrible thing, but they've made him into a martyr, which is actually going to work against them.
Yeah, I would have thought so, Simon.
Yeah, look, I mean, not only is, I think, the point that he's making about freedom of speech, academic inquiry and scientific integrity important, but he's also the nicest bloke. I mean, you know, you see that coming across in the cross tonight. He's an incredibly polite man. He's someone with a great deal of personal integrity. And I think the way that he's conducted himself actually has been incredibly reasonable throughout this whole process. I think the way that he's criticised some of the research that's been coming out of some of these organisations, including his own, has been really respectful. I don't think that there's a way that he could have done it with more grace.
Yeah, he's very brave. Tanveer, you've had experience of all this in the academic world as well. It must concern you, the chilling effect.
Look, these are these trends that have really been playing out in the United States, to some extent Britain. We haven't seen quite as much of it here, but this is very much an example. And what you see is a religious fervour in sections of the university, particularly around identity politics, the environment, gender, these kind of things. And it's one of the things I have seen a little, but not to this extent where an academic has been, you know, outright stuff, is where the measures of what constitute offence is steadily diluted to the point where students and academics see something they don't like and call it violent. Yeah. And that's almost what's happening.
Well, in his case, they're talking about the tone. It's not so much what he said, but the way he said it. Give me a break. Jane, of course, we have seen a bit of a taste of this in Australia before, in particular when it comes to Bjorn Lomborg, who was certainly rejected by South Australian universities. I think he was rejected in the West first, wasn't he?
He was, yeah, at UWA. Look, I went back to university as a mature age student about 10 years ago, and I was dismayed to see that we don't have the contest of ideas that many of us who aren't in universities think that you do have. I mean, the whole idea of going to university is to throw all of the ideas up in the air and dissect them. That's what a good critical analysis, a good critical essay is. But I learned very quickly, and I went to a couple of very prestigious universities on the East Coast and here in WA, and I learned quickly that in some particular courses, with some particular lecturers, just to write for the lecturer if I wanted to get an HD. And that's exactly how it is. And I was dismayed at the time to discover it, because as an older person going back to university, you expect people to have really a lot of questions, really expansive minds. Some lecturers and tutors facilitated that, but there were quite a few who didn't. So I'm unsurprised by this development, but I'm really glad that Peter is speaking out and that we now have evidence, we have proof, and we can all talk about it in forums such as this.
Yeah, I can't wait for the court case. Let's sort this one out. I had a similar experience myself. I finished off my degree just over 10 years ago and did a report on the Indigenous people's push at the United Nations. And I knew I was arguing against the line they would expect, and they failed me. They failed me on that report.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, obviously I knew they wouldn't like my line, so I made sure it was a pretty well-argued piece, so I challenged it.
Doesn't matter, doesn't it?
No, I challenged it, thankfully. They have those processes. It came back with a credit and I passed the unit. But it's an interesting experience to go through.
It's about rigid adherence to ideology now.
Yeah.
I think it's frightening. I mean, you know, I sort of say that, you know, jokingly, but I think that is a really serious problem.
Scary.
we're seeing it play out too with what's going on at with the Ramsay Centre at ANU.
Absolutely. Of course,
There's no place in Australia, no university in Australia for Bjorn Lomborg's institute. There's no place in Australia. None of the universities in Australia will accept teaching a course dedicated to the foundations of Western civilization.
The foundations of Western civilization. This is the academy. This is the contest of ideas. This is the very foundations, and they won't allow it at the ANU. This is offensive.
Now, traditionally, we've been a little bit sheltered because we don't have people. We don't tend to live elsewhere for university, so you don't have the concentration of people on campus that concentrates this sort of stuff. But it's starting to, still pour out.
Gee, it's frightening. Actually, we'll have to come back to what's happening with the Ramsay Centre later on because that is extraordinary.
You're watching Kenny on Sunday on Sky News Live.